Okay, we are in parable number 30. That's hard to believe, but we've had 30 parables, 30 messages on these parables, and I have enjoyed studying them. I had never done a series on the parables, although I have preached on a few of them here and there, but not as a series. We're going to go to verse number 36. Luke chapter 7 and verse 36. I didn't get a connection this morning until this morning, and when I got up and I was going over these messages, the morning 10 o'clock message and then 11 o'clock message, and all of a sudden I said, you know what? These two messages go hand in hand. They go right. I mean, they're one is this one just sort of goes right up where the other one left off. And so it is a parable of love and forgiveness. A parable of love and forgiveness. Verse 36, the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with them. And he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment and stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with her tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake unto himself, saying, This man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner. Jesus answering said unto Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he saith, Say on. It's like saying, preach on, brother, preach on. Well, he's going to be sorry he said that pretty soon. Verse 41, there was a certain creditor. Now here's the parable. There was a certain creditor which had two debtors. The one owed 500 pence and the other 50. Let's just put it in our monetary values and say one owed $500, the other owed $50. And when they had nothing to say, he frankly forgave them both. When they had nothing to pay, he frankly, that means honestly, truly, forgave them both. Tell me therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered and said, I suppose that he to whom he forgave most. And he said unto him, that is, Jesus said to Simon, Thou hast rightly judged. He said, you got the message. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, Seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house. Thou gave me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with her tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman since the time I came in hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loveth much, and to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. He said unto her, Thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, Who is this man that forgiveth sins also? He said to the woman, Thy faith hath saved thee, go in peace. Now, let me give you a little background to this. There are three people involved in the story. There is the Pharisee. He is a seeking sinner, although he does not consider himself a sinner. He was like Nicodemus, who came to Jesus by night, and he was seeking to find out who Christ was. And Jesus was invited to dinner. This Pharisee, Simon is his name, invited Jesus to dinner, probably wanting to question him, find out more about him. However, we find out, as Jesus said, that he failed in a common courtesy, which is washing his guests' feet, or at least giving them water to where they could wash their feet. That was a common thing. When you came into a house, most of the people in that day, because of the climate, would wear sandals, and they would go through the dusty streets. They would come in, and they would wash their feet. He was really unsure of who Jesus was. He may have been postponing the washing of his feet until he was sure that Jesus was worthy of this honor. Now, the strange thing about this is that and in that day, it was a normal thing to have sort of an open invitation. In other words, anybody could attend the dinner, the meeting, but they would not eat. They would just sit around the walls or stand around the walls in order just to listen to the conversation. And especially Jesus, who was this miracle-working prophet or rabbi from Nazareth. And so the more the merrier. The more people that were there, even though they were not fed, the more people that were there, the more honor was bestowed upon the host. In this case, the Pharisee named Simon. So there was the Pharisee, and then there was Jesus. And I note this, that Jesus came to the house even though this man was unsure and insincere. And Jesus always, he never turned down an invitation, because he wanted people to know who he was. He knew who he was. He wanted to reveal that to other people. And we find that Jesus is the righteous judge, yet this man brought him in and began to judge him. He said, if this man were a real prophet, he would know who this woman was and would not acknowledge her. So Jesus understood. And so Jesus, he wanted to judge Jesus, but in the end, Jesus judged him and revealed a shameful truth about him. And then thirdly, there was the woman. She evidently came in with the visiting guest. Had she probably stayed back against the wall or sat down somewhere with her cloak over her face and head, she would not have been recognized and would have listened in to the conversation. But she didn't come to listen. She came to worship. She came because of that. And so there was a great misunderstanding on Simon's part. Let me mention about three things. He misjudged the woman. He was judging her by her past. He was judging her by her past reputation, which was being an immoral woman. He was judging her outward appearance and not her heart, like the Bible says, that God looks upon the heart. She stood behind him. That's a significant thing. She didn't come around in front of him and weep upon his feet and take her hair and wash his feet. No, she stood behind him. And probably her head would have been to the side, and she would have taken those tears and put them on her feet and taken her hair and put her hair and tried to sort of dry his feet off with her hair. And so we find out he misjudged the woman. She had repented to the point of tears. She was in tears. And now she came to worship. We see that this verse 39, we see his skepticism is revealed. He said, if this man, if he were a prophet, see, he was unsure about who Jesus was. He's trying to find out who Jesus was, but because he accepted the worship of this woman, he assumed that Jesus was not a prophet, he was not the Messiah. He would have known who this woman was, what she was, and would have rejected her and her worship. She knew who Jesus was. She knew him not only from the miracles on the streets, but she knew him as Savior. She knew him as her Lord. Look at verse 39. He misunderstood Jesus. We see his skepticism is revealed. As I said, he said, this man, if he were a prophet. And then he misjudged himself. He did not think of himself as a sinner. This is not, well, let me put it this way, positively. This is the root of ingratitude, is this thing of not seeing us ourselves as sinners. And this is the most ungrateful generation that ever has existed in the universe, and especially here in America. This woke generation, as they call it, they're not awake, they're asleep. They're asleep to the truth, they're asleep to our history, they're asleep to what their grandparents did when Grandma went down to the creek with a washboard and washed her clothes and then carried them back to the house and hung them out. They've never had to do that. They just throw them in a washer, hit a button, and they're done. Throw them in a dryer, hit a button, they're done. They don't know what work is. They don't know what hardship is. They're a spoiled generation, and not only that, they're ungrateful. They don't consider the blessings that they enjoy because of Grandma and because of Mom and Dad. And so he misunderstood the woman, he misunderstood Jesus. He misunderstood himself. He did not think himself as a sinner. And I said, this is the most ungrateful, unthankful generation that's ever existed. And Paul wrote in Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 3, the last days perilous times will come, and men shall be unthankful, as though it did not exist in the past. I'm telling you, we ought to be thankful this morning. We ought to be thankful for salvation, this lady was. She was so grateful for her salvation, her forgiveness, that she came in and made a public spectacle of herself, washed his feet with tears, not with a basin of water as Jesus would have done to wash his feet, but she washed them with her tears. She was weeping because she had been forgiven. We ought to be thankful for salvation, thankful for our forgiveness, thankful for the provision that God has made. Anybody this week go without a meal because the cupboard was empty? No, we're blessed people. If you ate a meal every day this week, you've been blessed of God. Protection. God has protected us. We ought to be thankful for that ever-present Spirit who will never leave us nor forsake us. We ought to also be thankful for grace in trials. Some of you probably indicated this morning by lifting your hand that you're going through certain trials, but His grace is sufficient. Thankful for a husband, thankful for a wife, thankful for our children, thankful for our parents, thankful for friends. I mean, you know, think about it. How many friends do you really have? I mean, people you can count on. And fellowship with, you know, so what we say, sort of let your hair down and just friends. Probably if you have 5 people like that, you're blessed. And so the parable reveals the root of the problem. Notice in verse 40. And Jesus answering said unto Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he saith, say on, Master, say on. Can you see him sitting back with his arms folded and said, go ahead, preacher, go ahead, preacher, go ahead, Jesus, preach to me. He didn't think Jesus could rebuke him for anything. He didn't think himself as a sinner. He didn't think Jesus had come up and found anything wrong in his life. He's probably one of those that said, I've kept the 10 Commandments. I've honored my mother and father. But he says in verse 41, the parable, there was a certain creditor which had 2 debtors. The one owed 500 pence, the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly, that means totally, honestly, completely, sincerely forgave them both. Tell me therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered and said, I suppose that he to whom he forgave most. And he said unto him, Thou hast rightly judged. You sort of got the point, Simon. You got what I'm talking about, but he's not really yet applied it to himself. Notice in verse 40, and Jesus answering said unto him. Can I say something? Jesus has something to say to all of us this morning. It might be in this message. It might have been in the 10 o'clock message. It might be something that I haven't even spoken on today, but if you'll come to church with an open heart and open ears, God will speak to you if you're open to it. This man wasn't even open to it. Jesus still preached to him. So are you listening? Will you hear and heed the message of Jesus this morning? Verse 41, 2 debtors, one owed 10 times more than the other. One owed 500, the other owed 50. So one was forgiven much and one was forgiven little. He forgave them both equally, frankly. All debts are forgiven, canceled, removed from the ledger. I can see this man, he's a creditor. And he has an accountant who works for him, and he calls the accountant over and says, see these 2 men just right on their page, on their ledger, canceled. Debt has been canceled. They owe me nothing. Simon understood the point. And the great question is, which of them will love him most? Who's going to love him most? He said, he to whom he forgave most. And he said, thou hast rightly judged. Verse 44, he said to the woman and said unto Simon, he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears. You didn't even give me water to wash my own feet, but she washed my feet, my stinking, dirty feet, with her hairs and her tears. Verse 45, thou gavest me no kiss. We know that in that day when you had a friend or an acquaintance or someone, the Amish people still do this, the Mennonites do this, and the men will kiss each other on the cheek. And we send people like the French people. If you've watched the news and see some French people meeting, they will do the same thing. It's just a custom that they did. He said, thou gavest me no kiss, but the woman since the time I came in hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment, not with oil, with a costly box of ointment. Verse 47, wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he said unto her, thy sins are forgiven. So let me repeat a thing that we talked about in Sunday school or in the morning service at 10 o'clock, that love gives, and love gives sacrificially. There have been all kind of people who've written about how much this ointment was worth. And some say it was worth a year's income for a woman like this. It was expensive, but she gave it sacrificially because she thought Jesus was worth it. Love worships fervently and unashamedly and perfectly. The reason, listen to me, the reason we do not love and the reason we do not worship is because we don't think of ourselves as great sinners even before we were saved, and do not think of ourselves as sinners saved by the grace of God after we are saved. God said, to whom much is forgiven. When you understand how much, how great God has forgiven you, it will it will overwhelm your heart, and you will worship. And you'll worship unashamedly and publicly. She's here weeping before this crowd. Not only the invited guests who were sitting at the tables eating, but the uninvited guests who were standing around the walls or sitting around the walls. I'm going to give you 2 points before I finish. Number one, we were horrible sinners before we were saved. The scriptures, the heart is deceitful and desperately wicked above all things. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that doeth good. And yet people, before they were saved, before maybe you were saved, you thought, well, I'm a sinner, but I ain't that bad of a sinner. All I can do is tell you I was lost, I was undone, I was unclean. I was wicked in my heart and thoughts and dreams and plans and ambitions. I had never been drunk, I'd never taken drugs, I'd never committed fornication, but I knew I was a sinner and a great sinner and a bad sinner, and that I deserved to go to hell, and that I had to be saved by the grace of God alone. I would never get to heaven telling God how good I was. Harry Ironside has written years ago. He probably preached in the early 1900s. And he told this story. He was preaching outside on a Sunday afternoon. Big crowd had gathered together to hear him preach. And this man, after the service, a man came up to him and said, Mr. Ironside, I am an agnostic, and I would like to debate you next Sunday afternoon at the Science Hall in, I think it was in London. Ironside said, I agree upon 2 conditions. Number one, that you will bring one man whose life has been saved from wickedness and sin and degradation to a life of purity and holiness. And number 2, that you will bring one woman, just one woman, and one man, one woman, with the same testimony, that she was saved and delivered from her sin because of the message of being an agnostic. Ironside said to him, I will bring 40 men, and I will bring 40 women who will testify that they have been saved and delivered from a life of wicked, ungodly sin by the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ. For the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. This man is standing there looking at Mr. Ironside, and all he could do was bow his head and walk away. He knew he would never find one person whose life had been transformed from a life of wickedness and sin and degradation and immorality and drunkenness and all that by the message of Gnosticism. He knew it would never happen. We were horrible, horrible sinners before we were saved. And number 2, when you recognize what a sinner you were and are, your heart will be filled with incomparable love and sacrificial worship. He said unto her, thy sins are forgiven. That Greek tense is perfect, passive, indicative. And the perfect and indicative tense means thy sins have been forgiven and are forgiven once and for all. He was not saying that you just now got saved. He said you're here because you have repented. You're here because you have been and will be saved forever, forgiven forever. Let me ask you a question. When is the last time you told God what a sinner you are? When you got on your knees and said, Lord, I am worthless. I'm such a wicked, My heart's still wicked above all things, desperately wicked. I'm still a sinner. I still have sinful thoughts, sinful desires. I'm still tempted, and many times tempted right to the point of committing some great sin, and it's because I'm such a wicked sinner. As long as a man told God that you were undeserving of any of his blessings. Oh, I don't deserve anything. You've been gracious to me, kind to me. You have saved me, and if that's all you ever did, I wouldn't even deserve that, much less the blessings I've enjoyed in those years since I've been saved. When was the last time you really came to the house of God to worship? She came not to listen. She came to worship. I'm glad when people come and their ears are open and they're saying, "Preacher, we want to hear the message. We're awake. We're listening with our hearts." But you also come to worship, like this woman did. When's the last time you really worshiped out of a thankful heart as a recipient of the mercy and grace of God? In 1 John, we just talked about the love that comes from God. This woman loved the Lord. She had trusted him. She had received and believed the love that God had for her. And she was now saved by the grace of God, had been saved, and would be saved forever. Isn't that a wonderful truth? I'm saved and saved forever. I don't have to worry about tomorrow doing something wrong and not being saved. No, we're the children of God. We've been birthed into the family. And though we do something wrong, just like with our children, we may not kick them out of the family. But we may chasten them. And God chastens us. The Bible says, for whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. He doesn't chasten us because he's angry and mad at us. It's because he loves us. Parents who love their children will chasten them, spank them, rebuke them when they do wrong. So how long has it been since you told God what a great sinner you are? Not were, are. We are in our hearts. Our heart hasn't changed. It's still wicked and desperately wicked, deceitful above all things. We still need the grace of God every day to love him, to serve him, to live holy. We'll never be what we ought to be unless we fall upon that grace and mercy of God. Or do you love him? The person who believes they have been forgiven the most will love the most. The person who understands the great debt that was owed. You weren't the 50, you were the 500 pence. And he said, to whom much is forgiven, to him much loveth. He loveth much. That's why we see ourselves as God just forgave us 50. That's not a big amount. That's not a big deal. So he that loveth little thinks he has been forgiven little. It doesn't matter if you're forgiven 50 or you're forgiven 500. The fact that God saved a sinner like me ought to bring about a love for him and a worship of him. She's not even in church. She's among people who recognize her. Simon recognized her as that woman that she used to be immoral. She was a prostitute. She was like Mary Magdalene, who was wicked and filled with 7 devils. But God had mercy on her, and she loved Jesus. Mary loved Jesus. Mary Magdalene loved Jesus. And anybody who really loves the Lord has realized, have seen, and realized how much God has forgiven them. And how great is that forgiveness. He frankly forgave them both. He honestly, truly, sincerely. He just didn't say to the 50, you're forgiven. And to the 500, you're really forgiven. No. He made no difference. He frankly told them both. He honestly, justly, honestly, sincerely forgave them equally. God didn't look at how much you sinned. God just said, you're a sinner. You deserve to go to hell. But I'm going to forgive you anyway. Let's bow for prayer, please, and heads are bowed and eyes are closed.